My brother raised his glass of vintage champagne and sneered in front of 50 elite guests. 34 and still not married. It must be rough spending New Year's Eve alone while the rest of us celebrate real milestones. The entire room erupted into laughter like it was the joke of the century. I simply set my crystal flute on the nearest table, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Do not worry about my life, Bradley. I have been married for 5 years." The room went dead silent. My name is Riley. I am 34 years old and a forensic accountant who specializes in investigating corporate fraud. I have spent my entire life as the black sheep of a family, obsessed with image status and wealth. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who thought they could walk all over you and tear you down for their own amusement. The Chicago winter outside was punishingly cold, but inside my parents' $3 million Tudor-style mansion in the affluent suburbs, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with pretentious wealth. My parents, Richard and Cynthia, had spared absolutely no expense for their annual New Year's Eve gala. The sprawling foyer and the interconnected living rooms were heavily decorated with towering floral arrangements that easily cost more than a normal person's annual salary. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner of the grand ballroom, while waiters in crisp white shirts and black ties circulated endlessly with silver trays of expensive caviar and imported truffles. There were exactly 50 guests in attendance tonight. These were not just close friends or casual acquaintances. They were country club presidents, powerful venture capitalists, local politicians, and high society elites who spent their entire lives measuring their human worth by the designer brand of their watches and the exclusive zip codes of their winter vacation homes. The air inside the mansion was thick with the smell of heavy, expensive perfume and the low, constant hum of conversations about stock portfolios and luxury trips to St. Bart's. I stood quietly near the massive stone fireplace, nursing a single glass of sparkling water. I was entirely used to being the invisible element in this house. While my mother worked the room in her custom silk gown and my father enthusiastically patted the backs of wealthy investors, I preferred to stay firmly out of the spotlight. My mind was professionally trained to observe details, to look for financial discrepancies, and to uncover hidden truths, which served me incredibly well in my career as a forensic accountant. Tonight, however, my mere presence was an annoyance to my family. I was the unmarried, unglamorous daughter who chose a practical, numbers-driven career over marrying into high society. Across the room stood the stark contrast to my existence: my older brother Bradley. At 36 years old, Bradley was the undeniable golden child of the family. He had the perfect, bright smile, the tailored Italian suit, and the effortless, magnetic charisma that charmed everyone he met. He was the chief executive officer of a tech startup that my parents proudly boasted about to anyone who would listen. To the outside world, he was a visionary entrepreneur on the absolute verge of changing the industry. But as someone who analyzed financial statements and cash flows for a living, I knew the truth was far less glamorous. Still, tonight was supposed to be a grand celebration of his impending success, or at least the elaborate illusion of it. He was holding court near the grand staircase, surrounded by a group of eager listeners, laughing loudly and soaking up the desperate adoration of my parents' friends. I checked my watch, wishing I could slip out the heavy oak front doors and drive back to my quiet, peaceful apartment in the city. I had only come tonight because my mother had relentlessly guilt-tripped me for weeks, claiming my absence would reflect poorly on their perfect family image. As the antique grandfather clock in the hallway edged closer to midnight, Bradley decided it was time to command the attention of the entire party. He picked up a silver spoon and clinked it sharply against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut right through the soft jazz music and the steady chatter. The massive room slowly quieted down as 50 expectant faces turned toward the golden child. Bradley cleared his throat and offered a bright, highly polished smile. "Friends, family, and esteemed guests," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Thank you all for joining us tonight to ring in the new year. It has been a year of incredible growth for my company and for our family. He paused, letting the polite applause wash over him. My parents beamed with absolute blind adoration from the front row of the crowd. Then Bradley's eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto me standing quietly by the fireplace. His smile shifted into something much sharper and infinitely more cruel. He could never just let me exist in peace. He always needed to push me down to elevate himself further in front of an audience. And as we look forward to the future, he continued, his voice carrying a mock sympathetic tone. We also have to remember those who are struggling to keep up. Take my little sister Riley, for example. He gestured toward me with his glass, and all 50 heads pivoted in my direction. 34 years old and still not married. Not. No ring on that finger, no prospects in sight. It must be rough spending New Year's Eve alone year after year, while the rest of us celebrate real milestones like marriage and building empires. The cruelty was so casual and so perfectly delivered that it took a second for the crowd to process it. Then my mother let out a high-pitched, forced laugh, as if it were the most delightful joke she had ever heard. My father chuckled along with her, and within seconds the entire room erupted into laughter. 50 elite guests laughing at my expense, mocking my life, my choices, and my supposed loneliness. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck, but I did not look away. I did not shrink into the shadows the way I would have when I was 20 years old. I had spent years analyzing raw data, uncovering terrible truths that very powerful people tried to hide. I was not a scared little girl anymore. I let them laugh. I let the sound bounce off the expensive artwork and the vaulted ceilings. I slowly stepped forward, moving away from the stone fireplace so I was clearly visible to everyone in the room. The laughter began to die down, replaced by a murmuring curiosity. I walked over to a nearby mahogany side table and calmly set my glass down. The clink of the crystal against the wood was soft, but very deliberate. I looked straight into Bradley's smug eyes and let my voice carry through the dead quiet room. It was steady, cold, and entirely void of the embarrassment he so desperately wanted to see. "Do not worry about my life, Bradley," I said, projecting my words clearly so the venture capitalists and socialites would hear every single syllable. "You really do not need to concern yourself with my relationship status. I have actually been married for 5 years." The reaction was instantaneous. The remaining chuckles died abruptly in the throats of the guests. The jazz quartet in the corner completely stopped playing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rugs. My mother's jaw went slack, her expensive wine glass freezing halfway to her lips. My father's face lost all its jovial color, turning a sudden pale shade of gray. Bradley simply stared at me, his smug smile wiped clean off his face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated confusion. The golden child had thrown his best punch, and I had just rewritten the entire script of the evening. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, wrapping around the room like a heavy winter coat. Nobody moved. The wealthy investors stared. The local politicians exchanged confused glances. Then my mother, Cynthia, shattered the quiet. She let out a shrill, condescending laugh that echoed harshly against the vaulted ceilings. It was a practiced, theatrical sound, the kind she used when a country club waiter spilled wine on her designer shoes and she wanted to pretend she was not furious. "Oh, Riley," my mother said, stepping forward with a tight, pitying smile plastered across her face. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she shook her head. "You have always had such an active imagination. Really, sweetheart, making up a fake husband just because your brother made a little joke? It is getting pathetic at this age." I did not break eye contact with her. I did not flinch. "I am not making anything up, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. Cynthia waved her hand dismissively, addressing the crowd as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Please forgive my daughter, everyone. She has always struggled with reality when she feels left out. She turned her cold, calculating eyes back to me. Her voice dropped an octave, meant only for me and the people standing closest. Stop this immediately. If you actually went and married some deadbeat loser in secret, some criminal or broke bartender just to spite us, I swear I will disown you tonight. You are not dragging our family name through the mud because you could not find a proper man. My father, Richard, finally found his voice. He marched over to join my mother, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. His priority, as always, was damage control. He looked around at his wealthy friends, his business partners, his golfing buddies, and then glared at me with absolute disgust. "Riley, that is enough," my father hissed, stepping into my personal space to intimidate me. "You are embarrassing your mother, you are embarrassing your brother on his big night, and you are embarrassing me in front of my investors. I want you to leave, right now. Go get your coat and walk out the back door so nobody sees you crying." He pointed a thick finger toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. He fully expected me to obey. For my entire childhood, that tone of voice had been absolute law. Whenever I outshone Bradley, whenever I asked for support, whenever I dared to take up space in their perfect world, Richard and Cynthia would shut me down and send me away. They wanted me to be the sad, lonely spinster who slinked out the back door in shame. Bradley recovered his composure, leaning against the grand staircase with a renewed, arrogant smirk. "Yes, sis," he chimed in, swirling the remaining champagne in his flute. "Go home. If you really had a husband, a real man who could stand in a room like this, you would have brought him tonight. But you did not, because he does not exist, or because he is so pathetic, you are too ashamed to show his face." The guests began to whisper. The low buzz of gossip filled the grand ballroom. I could hear the judgmental murmurs from the socialites in their evening gowns. They were eating this up, absorbing the drama like it was the main course of the evening. They believed my parents. They looked at me with varying degrees of pity and scorn, fully buying into the narrative that I was a desperate, lying spinster trying to steal the spotlight from my highly successful brother. I stood my ground. My heart was beating steadily. My mind was sharp, evaluating the room, calculating the precise moment to deliver the next piece of reality. I looked at Bradley, leaning there in his expensive suit, entirely unaware of how completely his fraudulent little empire was about to crumble. I looked at my parents, so desperately clinging to their fabricated social status. And then I looked past them, catching the eye of my sister-in-law, Kiara. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Kiara was a brilliant, hard-working African-American woman who had married into this toxic mess. She was the only person in this house who had ever treated me with genuine kindness. She looked at me now with a mixture of concern and quiet solidarity. She knew what this family was capable of. I turned my attention back to my father. "I am not leaving, Richard," I said, dropping the title of father entirely. "And I am not crying. I have absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about tonight." Cynthia gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. "How dare you speak to your father that way? Who do you think you are?" "I am a woman who is tired of your lies," I stated simply. "And to answer your question, Bradley, about why my husband did not walk in with me tonight." I slowly raised my left arm and checked my watch. It was a sleek silver timepiece I had bought for myself when I opened my forensic accounting firm. The time was exactly 11:15. "He had a late conference call with his board of directors in Tokyo," I announced casually, letting my hand drop back to my side. "He took a separate car. Actually, he just texted me 2 minutes ago. He is parking the car in the driveway right now." The whispering among the guests escalated instantly. The tension in the ballroom skyrocketed, thick and electric. Cynthia let out a harsh, disbelieving scoff. "Parking the car? What, did his beat-up old Honda break down at the gates? Is he walking up the driveway in a pair of dirty work boots? I swear, Riley, if you let some uneducated, lower-class loser walk into my home and ruin this party, I will have security throw you both out on the street." My father crossed his arms, his chest puffing out. I am going to stop this right now. I am going to the front door, and whoever this imaginary husband of yours is, I am turning him away. This is an exclusive gathering. We do not let garbage into this house." Bradley laughed, pushing off the staircase. "I will come with you, Dad. I want to see the look on this guy's face when we bounce him from the property. This should be hilarious. Let us go see what kind of trash my little sister managed to drag out of the gutter." They did not get the chance to take a single step. The heavy brass handles of the massive oak front doors turned with a loud, metallic click. The sound echoed clearly across the marble floors of the foyer, cutting through the whispers of the elite crowd. Everyone in the ballroom froze, their eyes locked on the entryway. The doors swung open, letting a blast of freezing Chicago winter wind into the overheated mansion. I did not flinch. I just smiled, a small, cold, knowing smile. The gaslighting was officially over. The reality check had arrived, and it was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo. The freezing Chicago wind swept through the grand foyer as the heavy oak doors swung wide open. Snowflakes danced in the chandelier light before melting into the imported marble floor. Stepping across the threshold was a man who required no introduction in the corporate world, but remained a mystery to my arrogant family. Hayes stood at 6 feet 2 inches of pure, unadulterated authority. He brushed snowflakes from the shoulder of his midnight blue bespoke tuxedo. Every single detail about him, from the razor-sharp cut of his lapels to the calm, predatory stillness in his dark eyes, radiated power. He did not look around the room, seeking approval or validation the way my father and brother constantly did. Hayes owned whatever room he walked into by simple virtue of being the most formidable person in it. The reaction from the 50 elite guests gathered in my parents' ballroom was instantaneous. These people spent their days navigating the cutthroat waters of high finance. They knew exactly who had just walked through the doors. Whispering started near the entryway and spread through the crowd like wildfire. I watched as a prominent hedge fund manager actually took a physical step back. An influential local politician subtly adjusted his tie, trying to stand taller. The name rippled through the room in hushed, reverent tones. Hayes, the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. In the private equity sector, Hayes was known as an absolute shark. His firm managed billions, and he had a legendary reputation for dismantling failing companies without a single ounce of mercy. He was the man these socialites begged for meetings with. He was the man who dictated market trends with a single phone call. And right now he was standing in my parents' suburban mansion, uninvited by the hosts. I turned my attention to Bradley. My older brother was still leaning against the grand staircase where he had been mocking me moments before. The transformation on his face was a masterpiece of pure terror. All the color drained from his perfectly tanned skin, leaving him a sickly shade of chalk white. His jaw hung slack. His fingers suddenly lost their grip. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from his hand and plummeted toward the floor. It hit the marble with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound echoed loudly in the painfully quiet ballroom, but Bradley did not even flinch. He did not look down at the mess spreading across my mother's pristine floor. His wide, panicked eyes were locked entirely on Hayes. I knew exactly why my brother looked like he was about to vomit. For the past 6 months, Bradley had been engaged in a desperate, pathetic campaign to secure a meeting with Apex Holdings. His tech startup was bleeding money at an alarming rate. He was drowning in debt, failing to meet payroll, and burning through his initial investors' cash. Apex Holdings was his final Hail Mary. He had sent endless emails and begged lower-level associates at Hayes' firm for just 5 minutes of the chief executive officer's time to pitch a rescue investment. Every single attempt had been met with a cold, automated rejection or complete silence. Bradley viewed Hayes as his golden ticket out of the massive financial crater he had dug for himself. Now the man who held Bradley's entire future in the palm of his hand was standing in our foyer. Hayes calmly closed the heavy oak doors behind him, shutting out the bitter winter storm. He handed his cashmere overcoat to a stunned waiter without looking at the man. Then he began to walk. The crowd of millionaires and socialites literally parted for him like the Red Sea. Men who normally dominated boardrooms squeezed against the walls to get out of his way. Women who had been sneering at me 5 minutes earlier now stared at him in absolute awe. Hayes ignored all of them. He did not acknowledge the hedge fund managers trying to catch his eye. He did not spare a glance for my father, who was standing near the center of the room, entirely bewildered. My mother was clutching her pearl necklace, staring at the shattered glass by my brother's feet. I caught the eye of my sister-in-law Kiara, standing near the staircase. As an intelligent and observant woman, Kiara recognized exactly what was unfolding. A knowing smile crept onto her face as she rested her hands on her pregnant belly, enjoying the silence that had finally shut her abusive husband up. Hayes kept his dark eyes locked exclusively on me. His expression, which was normally reserved and impenetrable in public, softened the moment our gazes met. He closed the distance between us with smooth strides. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it inverted completely. A massive invisible weight lifted off my shoulders as my husband came to a halt right in front of me. He reached out and gently cupped my cheek. His touch was warm and incredibly grounding. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead, right there in front of the 50 people who had just spent the last 20 minutes treating me like a delusional outcast. When Hayes pulled back, he kept one strong arm wrapped securely around my waist, anchoring me to his side. He looked down at me with a perfectly calm smile. "I apologize for the delay, my love," he said, his resonant voice carrying through the dead silent ballroom. The snow on the interstate was worse than expected. He then slowly turned his head to survey the room of frozen guests, his eyes scanning the shocked faces of my mother, my father, and my trembling brother. Hayes let his gaze rest on Bradley, whose knees looked like they were about to buckle. "Is there a problem here?" Hayes asked, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet, lethal authority. "Or did I interrupt a private joke?" The silence following my husband's question was so absolute you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. No one dared to breathe. Then the survival instincts of a desperate man kicked in. Bradley snapped out of his terrified paralysis. The sheer, blinding greed overtook his fear. He looked at the shattered crystal at his feet and simply stepped right over it, completely ignoring the mess. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. He forced a manic, desperate smile onto his face and practically lunged across the marble floor toward us. "Hayes," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with a mixture of forced joviality and raw panic. "Brother-in-law, I cannot believe it." Bradley threw his arms wide open, aiming for a familiar masculine embrace as if they were old college friends reuniting. It was a grotesque display of unearned familiarity. He moved in fast, expecting Hayes to reciprocate the gesture in front of the 50 elite guests. Hayes did not even blink. He did not change his expression. With the smooth, effortless grace of a predator avoiding a clumsy attack, he simply shifted his weight. He pulled me securely with him, pivoting his shoulders just a fraction of an inch. Bradley stumbled forward, grasping at empty air. His momentum carried him awkwardly past us, and his arms dropped to his sides in a pathetic display of physical rejection. A few of the wealthy investors in the crowd actually winced at the brutal public snub. Hayes completely ignored my stumbling brother. He did not even glance in Bradley's direction. Instead, he turned his full, undivided attention back to me. His dark eyes scanned my face, meticulously searching for any lingering signs of distress or humiliation. He leaned down and pressed another soft, deliberate kiss to my temple, reinforcing his protective stance in front of the very people who had just tried to tear me down. "Are these people bothering you?" he asked, his tone dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. The implication was crystal clear. If I gave the word, he would dismantle every single person in this room without a second thought. Before I could answer, the sheer gravity of the situation finally registered in the minds of my parents. The realization of the immense wealth and unchecked power standing in their foyer completely overrode their previous disgust. The pivot was so fast, it would have given a normal person whiplash. Cynthia practically materialized beside us. Her face, which had been twisted in a snarl of elitist rage moments before, was now stretched into a grotesque, fawning mask of maternal affection. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Bothering her, oh heavens no, she gushed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She reached out with a manicured hand, attempting to lovingly stroke my arm. I took a deliberate step back, moving further into the shelter of my husband's embrace. Cynthia's hand hovered awkwardly in the air for a second before she smoothly redirected her attention to Hayes. Her eyes were practically glittering with dollar signs. "Mr. Hayes, I mean son," she corrected herself, letting out a shrill, delighted laugh that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "Welcome to our home. We are just so completely surprised. Riley is always so modest, keeping such a wonderful, incredibly successful man a secret from her own family. We were just teasing her, you see. It was all just a big misunderstanding." Richard stepped up right behind her, puffing out his chest but simultaneously bowing his head slightly in a pathetic show of submission. The man who had just ordered me to sneak out the back door in shame was now offering his hand to my husband with a desperate, eager grin. "Richard here," he said, projecting his voice so his business associates would see him fraternizing with the titan of private equity. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet the man who stole our daughter's heart. We have heard so much about your firm. Brilliant work you are doing over there at Apex. Just brilliant." Hayes looked down at my father's outstretched hand. He looked at it as if Richard were offering him a diseased piece of trash. He did not move a single muscle to accept the handshake. The silence stretched again, punishing and humiliating. Richard awkwardly lowered his hand, wiping his sweaty palm on the side of his tailored trousers. He let out a nervous, booming laugh that echoed in the quiet room, trying desperately to save face in front of the country club presidents and politicians who were watching his every move. Cynthia, sensing the escalating public humiliation and the hungry, judgmental eyes of the 50 guests, realized she needed to contain the situation immediately. They needed to get Hayes away from the crowd before he humiliated them any further. More importantly, they needed to get him into a controlled environment where they could work their manipulation. "Why do we not take this out of the crowded hallway?" Cynthia suggested, clapping her hands together with frantic enthusiasm. "It is so loud out here and we have so much to talk about. Richard has a beautiful private study just down the hall. We can pour some fine scotch, get away from all this noise, and finally catch up properly as a family. Just the 5 of us. It will be so wonderful." I looked at my mother, seeing right through the thin veneer of her hospitality. I knew exactly what this was. The private study was where my father conducted his ruthless business dealings. It was the room where they intimidated people. It was a trap. They wanted to corner Hayes behind closed doors where the public could not see them beg. They saw my husband as a walking bank vault, and they were actively plotting how to extract the $5 million Bradley so desperately needed to keep his fraudulent startup from sinking. I glanced over at the staircase and saw Kiara watching us. Her eyes conveyed a silent warning, confirming my suspicions. She knew what her husband and in-laws were capable of behind closed doors. I turned my gaze back to Hayes, communicating silently with him. He held my gaze, his dark eyes reading my mind perfectly. He gave a microscopic nod, indicating he was ready for whatever game they wanted to play. I turned back to the 3 predators masquerading as my family. I let a cold, calculating smile touch my lips. A private family catch-up in the study. I said, my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "That sounds like a fantastic idea, Mother. We would love to join you. Let us go catch up." Cynthia beamed as if she had just won the lottery, entirely oblivious to the trap I was laying for them. "Wonderful," she chirped, gesturing toward the grand hallway. "Right this way." Bradley wiped the sweat from his brow and practically sprinted ahead to open the study doors, eager to secure his financial salvation. They thought they were walking us into an ambush. They had absolutely no idea that they were simply locking themselves inside the cage with the lions. The heavy, soundproof doors of my father's private study clicked shut, sealing us inside. The sudden absence of the jazz quartet and the murmuring crowd was jarring. This room was a fortress of mahogany and dark leather smelling faintly of expensive cigar smoke. The second the heavy brass latch engaged, the remaining shreds of social etiquette vanished from my family's faces. Cynthia dropped her fake maternal smile, entirely revealing her true calculating nature. Richard marched straight toward his liquor cabinet, pouring himself a massive glass of amber liquid with trembling hands. But Bradley was the most desperate of them all. The golden child did not even bother offering Hayes a seat or a drink. His eyes were wide and frantic, and a fresh layer of sweat glistened on his forehead as he prepared his attack. Bradley practically dove across the room toward my father's massive desk. He scrambled through a disorganized leather briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he dropped several folders onto the floor. He ignored the mess and finally yanked out a thick, glossy presentation binder. He spun around and lunged back toward Hayes, completely ignoring my existence. He stepped in front of me, physically attempting to corner my husband against the bookshelves. Hayes did not retreat a single inch. He simply stood there, a monolith of bespoke midnight blue wool, looking down at my frantic brother with an expression of mild curiosity. Brother-in-law Bradley started, his voice pitching up an octave in his desperate excitement. I know this is highly unconventional, but since we are family now, we can skip the corporate red tape. I run a tech firm. We are disrupting the cloud storage market. We are currently valued at $50 million by our internal analysts. But we are in a rapid growth phase right now, and we need a strategic partner to help us scale. I am offering you an exclusive family opportunity to get in on the ground floor. We just need a simple $5 million emergency capital injection by tomorrow morning. He shoved the glossy pitch deck directly into my husband's chest. I watched my brother panting slightly, his eyes begging Hayes to take the bait. He was drowning, and he thought he had just found a solid gold life raft. Hayes looked down at the binder pressing against his tuxedo jacket. He did not reach for it immediately. He let Bradley stand there holding the weight of his own failure for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Richard had stopped drinking his scotch, watching the exchange with bated breath. Cynthia was clutching the back of a leather armchair. Finally, Hayes slowly raised his right hand and took the pitch deck from Bradley's sweaty grip. He did not say a word. He did not offer a polite smile. Hayes simply opened the binder. The thick, expensive pages rustled loudly in the dead, silent room. I stood quietly near the door, watching my husband work. I knew exactly what he was looking at, because I had spent the last 5 weeks utilizing my forensic accounting skills to tear those exact same numbers to absolute pieces. I knew every lie and every fraudulent projection printed on those glossy pages. Bradley shifted his weight from foot to foot, wiping his clammy palms on his tailored trousers. He thought he could baffle Hayes with tech buzzwords and aggressive charts showing exponential growth. He fundamentally misunderstood the man he was dealing with. Hayes flipped straight to the financial breakdown in the back of the deck. His dark eyes scanned the columns of data, processing the numbers with ruthless efficiency. After precisely 2 minutes, Hayes closed the binder. The sharp snap of the thick cardboard cover sounded exactly like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet study. He slowly looked up and locked his cold, predatory gaze directly onto Bradley. $50 million, Hayes said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. Yes, exactly, Bradley eagerly agreed, nodding his head. A conservative valuation, really, given our market penetration. Hayes did not blink. Your user acquisition costs are inflated by roughly 400%, he stated, methodically tearing the first hole in Bradley's fantasy. You are categorizing free trial accounts as active paying subscribers to artificially inflate your active user base. That is not market penetration, Bradley. That is a basic statistical manipulation designed to trick amateur venture capitalists. Bradley's mouth dropped open. The color drained from his face. But we have projected revenue, he stammered, taking a step backward. Our pipeline is massive. Phantom revenue streams. Hayes corrected him, slicing through the lie with surgical precision. You are booking anticipated sales as realized income on your balance sheets. Half the contracts you list here are either unsigned or pending legal review. Your overhead is bleeding your initial capital dry. You are currently burning through $800,000 a month on executive salaries and luxury marketing events, while your actual product remains in a beta testing phase full of critical bugs. Richard slammed his whiskey glass down. Now listen here, he interjected, trying to save his son. Every startup has a high burn rate. You have to spend money to make money. It is a solid company. Hayes turned his icy gaze to my father. It is a catastrophic failure, Richard. The math does not lie, even when the executives do. You do not have a $50 million company. You have $10 million in unsecured debt and a business model that is fundamentally broken. Hayes held the pitch deck out. Bradley was too paralyzed by shock to take it. Hayes simply let go. The heavy, glossy binder dropped, hitting the floor with a loud thud that made my mother jump. I do not fund fantasies. Hayes declared, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. I am not giving you a $5 million emergency capital injection. I would not give you $5 for this garbage. Your company is a sinking ship, and I do not buy tickets on the Titanic. The absolute destruction of Bradley's ego was immediate and devastating. The golden child stood there trembling, staring down at his rejected pitch deck on the floor. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He had banked everything on his ability to charm his way into my husband's wallet, and Hayes had just mathematically executed him in under 3 minutes. The air in the soundproof study grew dangerously thin. The initial shock on my parents' faces was rapidly transforming into something much darker and far more desperate. They had been backed into a corner, and toxic people are always the most dangerous when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. The silence in the soundproof study stretched into something brittle and highly volatile. Bradley stared blankly at his ruined pitch deck on the floor. Richard gripped his crystal whiskey glass so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. Then my mother made her move. Cynthia did not shed a single tear. She did not offer a maternal plea or attempt to salvage the loving family facade she had paraded in front of her high society guests just minutes prior. Instead, her posture stiffened into something rigid and fiercely calculated. The warm, hospitable host vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered predator ready to strike. If logic and business fundamentals will not persuade you. Hayes, Cynthia stated, her voice dropping into a calm register. Then I suppose we will have to rely on leverage. She turned her back on us and walked toward the far end of the room. Behind my father's massive mahogany desk hung a large, expensive oil painting. Cynthia reached out and smoothly swung the heavy framed canvas to the side, revealing a flush digital wall safe hidden in the dark wood paneling. The electronic beeps of the keypad echoed sharply in the quiet room as she rapidly punched in a 6-digit passcode. A heavy metallic clack signaled the locking mechanism disengaging. My forensic accounting instincts immediately went on high alert. People like my parents did not keep wall safes in their home offices to protect family heirlooms. They kept them specifically to hide their most dangerous and toxic liabilities. Cynthia reached into the dark metal cavity and pulled out a thick, bulging manila envelope. She closed the safe, swung the painting back into position, and marched straight back to the center of the room. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes locked entirely on Hayes. She raised her arm and slammed the heavy envelope down onto the polished surface of the mahogany desk. The sharp, aggressive smack of paper hitting wood made Bradley jump, but a desperate glimmer of hope reignited in his panicked eyes. He knew exactly what was in that envelope. You are a very smart man, Hayes. My mother began, resting both her manicured hands on the desk and leaning forward. You protect your investments and your firm. Apex Holdings has a pristine reputation. You cannot afford scandals. You certainly cannot afford a federal investigation bringing negative press to your doorstep and spooking your high-net-worth shareholders. Hayes did not break eye contact. He stood with his hands resting casually in his tuxedo pockets, completely unfazed by her aggressive posturing. "I am not easily intimidated by desperate people, Cynthia," he replied, his voice smooth and dangerous. "If you have a point, I suggest you get to it quickly." Cynthia untwisted the string closure on the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents. I could see the distinctive letterhead of several major banking institutions and what looked like official tax filing forms. 5 years ago, Cynthia said, her voice echoing with shameless venom, Bradley needed initial seed capital to get his first tech venture off the ground. The banks were being entirely unreasonable. They refused to approve his commercial loan applications because he lacked sufficient collateral at the time. But we had another resource. She finally turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were devoid of any maternal warmth. They were flat cold and utterly ruthless. Riley had pristine credit. Cynthia continued casually confessing to a severe federal crime, as if she were discussing the weather. She had zero debt, a perfect payment history, and a brand new high-paying job. So Richard and I did what any supportive parents would do to ensure the success of their family. We used Riley's social security number. We forged her signature on a series of financial documents, and we took out a $200,000 business loan in her name. The sheer audacity of her confession hung in the heavy air. My father shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable, but he did not utter a single word to stop her. He was entirely complicit. They had stolen my identity without a second thought. They hijacked my financial future to fund my brother's delusions of grandeur while treating me like dirt. But that is not the best part. Cynthia smirked, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the stack of papers. We did not just take out a loan. Over the past 5 years, we carefully structured a series of shell transactions. We doctored the financial records to make it look like Riley was the sole architect of the entire scheme. We created a paper trail that points directly to her, indicating she intentionally defrauded the bank to evade federal taxes and launder money through Bradley's startup. Cynthia turned back to Hayes, her eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. "Here is the deal, son-in-law. You are going to open your briefcase, pull out your checkbook, and write a $5 million check to Bradley's company right now. You will clear his debts and provide the emergency capital he needs to keep his business afloat. If you refuse, I will walk out of this study and mail this entire envelope of evidence to the Internal Revenue Service and the State Accounting Board by tomorrow morning." She paused, letting the immense weight of her threat settle over the room. "If I send these documents," Cynthia hissed, "Riley will be immediately investigated for severe tax fraud and identity theft. The state board will permanently strip her of her forensic certified public accountant license. Her entire career will be destroyed overnight. She will face severe federal prison time, and you, Hayes, will be the billionaire chief executive officer married to a convicted felon. Your elite investors will pull their capital the very second the scandal breaks across the news. You will lose everything you have built just to protect her. So I suggest you pull out your pen and write the check. $5 million is a very small price to pay to keep your pristine corporate reputation entirely intact." She stood tall, crossing her arms over her chest, completely satisfied with her vile ultimatum. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she had outsmarted a billionaire and successfully backed a forensic accountant into a legal corner. She thought her forged documents were a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. She had absolutely no idea that I had been waiting for this exact moment for 5 long years. The silence that followed my mother's twisted declaration was abruptly shattered by a sharp gasp near the heavy oak doors. Everyone in the soundproof study whipped their heads around. Kiara stood there trembling. My 32-year-old sister-in-law had slipped into the room just before the doors sealed shut. She had been standing in the shadows of the tall mahogany bookshelves, clutching her 6-month pregnant belly, listening to every single vile word her in-laws had confessed to. Kiara was a striking African-American woman who had always been a glaring anomaly in this house of mirrors. She came from a family of hard-working, honest public school teachers who valued integrity above all else. Over the years, I had watched my parents treat her with thinly veiled condescension, serving up microaggressions wrapped in polite country club smiles. Bradley constantly diminished her, using her as a trophy when it suited his image and ignoring her when it did not. But Kiara had always possessed a quiet, fierce strength. Now that quiet strength erupted into absolute disgust. Kiara stepped out from the shadows, her face a mixture of profound horror and blinding rage. She marched straight toward the center of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She deliberately positioned her pregnant frame directly between me and my mother, creating a physical barricade against Cynthia's toxicity. "Are you out of your mind?" Kiara demanded, her voice shaking with raw emotion, but ringing with absolute clarity. "You stole her identity. You committed federal fraud, and now you are trying to blackmail her husband for $5 million. This is not a family business deal. This is a criminal enterprise." Cynthia recoiled as if she had been slapped. She clutched the manila envelope tighter to her chest, her eyes narrowing at the woman she had always viewed as a subordinate. "Keep your voice down, Kiara," my mother hissed, glancing nervously at the soundproof doors. "This is family business. You need to step aside and let Bradley secure our future." "There is no future built on identity theft," Kiara fired back, refusing to yield a single inch. I knew Bradley was struggling with the startup. I knew things were tight. But I had no idea I married into a family of thieves. I am not raising my child around people who would destroy their own daughter's life just to fund a scam. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. "If you do not put those forged documents away right now," Kiara warned, her tone dropping into a deadly, serious register, "I will dial the police myself. I will stand right out in that ballroom in front of all your wealthy friends and tell the authorities exactly what I just heard you confess to. I will hand over my own husband if it means protecting an innocent woman from going to federal prison for your crimes." The threat hit the room like a localized earthquake. Richard backed away from his desk, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. Cynthia froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unprecedented defiance of her daughter-in-law. But it was Bradley who absolutely shattered. The prospect of losing his $5 million bailout, combined with his wife's public insubordination, triggered a massive, catastrophic meltdown. The golden child facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but a volatile, entitled tyrant. Bradley let out a guttural roar of pure rage. He threw his empty hands in the air, his face contorting into an ugly, vicious mask. "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful witch!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he stomped toward her. "How dare you threaten my mother? How dare you try to ruin my company? You are nothing without me. Do you hear me? Nothing." Kiara held her ground. "You lied to me, Bradley." She shot back, tears welling in her eyes. "You told me the business was fine. You told me we were secure. You are a fraud. I gave you everything." Bradley bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the expensive wood paneling. "I gave you this lifestyle. I gave you access to this house. You think anyone is going to believe you over me? I will throw you out on the street tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back. I will hire the best lawyers in Chicago, and I will take that baby from you the second it is born. You will never see a single dime of my money, and you will never see your child. I will destroy you, Kiara." The sheer venom in his voice was sickening. He was completely out of control, feeding on his own panic and rage. He took another aggressive step forward, raising his hand in a threatening gesture, his eyes blazing with a dangerous, unpredictable fury. He was actually going to strike his pregnant wife. He never got the chance to complete the motion. I moved faster than Bradley could even process. I stepped forcefully around Kiara, inserting myself directly into Bradley's path. I locked my eyes onto his, meeting his chaotic rage with a cold, lethal focus that stopped him dead in his tracks. I slammed my palm against his chest, pushing him back. "Do not even think about it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "If you take one more step toward her, I will make sure you do not have a company, a reputation, or a life left to defend." I gripped Kiara's arm, pulling her safely behind my shoulder. I could feel her shaking against my back, but I stood like a stone wall between her and the monster she had married. Bradley scrambled to regain his balance, glaring at me. "You think you can protect her?" he sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. "You cannot even protect yourself, Riley. Mom has you dead to rights. You are going to lose your license and go to prison." I kept my eyes locked on his sweating face. I let a smile spread across my lips. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I turned my head slightly, looking back over my shoulder at my husband, who was standing perfectly still, watching the entire scene with a dark, calculated amusement. "Give me the briefcase," I said softly. Hayes stepped forward from the periphery of the room, moving with that same terrifying and calculated grace that had completely paralyzed my brother moments ago. He did not rush. He did not say a word. He simply raised his left hand, which held a sleek, heavy titanium briefcase. The metallic surface of the case caught the ambient light from the chandelier overhead, gleaming with an industrial coldness that stood in stark contrast to the warm mahogany and soft leather of my father's study. Hayes walked directly over to the massive desk. He did not ask for permission to invade my father's personal workspace. He simply cleared a space with the back of his hand, pushing aside a crystal paperweight and a stack of unread mail. Then he set the titanium briefcase down, right next to the pathetic, crumpled manila envelope my mother had just weaponized against me. The sound of the dual metallic latches, disengaging, echoed through the soundproof room with two sharp, aggressive clicks. It sounded like the cocking of a shotgun. Hayes flipped the lid open and took a single step back, allowing me to take the floor. I looked at my mother, whose hand was still hovering near her own forged documents. I looked at my father, whose face was currently trapped between confusion and mounting dread. Finally, I looked at Bradley, who was still breathing heavily from his pathetic outburst against Kiara. For the very first time since I had stepped foot inside this toxic house, I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not a defensive smile. It was a genuine, terrifying smile of absolute predatory anticipation. "You really have no idea what I actually do for a living, do you?" "Mother," I asked, my voice echoing with a calm, icy resonance. "For 5 years, you have told your high society friends that I was just a glorified bookkeeper, pushing pencils at some mediocre firm. You mocked my degree. You mocked my career choice because it was not glamorous enough for your country club dinners. You thought I was just sitting in a cubicle somewhere crying over the fact that you abandoned me." I reached out and rested my fingertips on the edge of the open titanium briefcase. "Allow me to properly reintroduce myself." I continued, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. "I am a forensic certified public accountant. I do not just balance ledgers and file tax returns. I specialize in corporate fraud investigation and financial litigation. I am the person that federal regulatory agencies bring in when they need to pierce the corporate veil of corrupt organizations. I spend my days tracking hidden assets, unraveling offshore shell companies, dismantling money laundering operations, and testifying as an expert witness in federal court. I hunt down financial criminals for a living, and I am incredibly ruthless at my job." The color began to drain from my mother's face. Her hand slowly retreated from her manila envelope as the reality of my words started to sink in. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Did you honestly think I would just walk away when you ruined my credit score 5 years ago?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Did you really believe I would just let you steal my identity, forge my signature, and saddle me with $200,000 of fraudulent debt without fighting back? You completely underestimated me. The moment you kicked me out of this house, I did not break down. I went to work. I reached into the titanium briefcase. It was not filled with a few loose papers like my mother's pathetic envelope. It was packed to the brim with perfectly organized, thick black leather binders. Each binder was meticulously labeled with gold embossed lettering. I grabbed the first stack of documents, which was easily 3 times as heavy as the files Cynthia had slammed on the desk earlier. I pulled the stack out and dropped it onto the mahogany surface. The heavy thud made the entire desk shake. I have spent the last 5 years quietly, comprehensively, and legally auditing every single aspect of your lives, I announced, letting the sheer magnitude of that statement wash over the room. Every bank account you have ever opened, every wire transfer you have ever authorized, every tax return you have filed, every property deed, every mortgage, every single credit card transaction. I tracked it all. I followed the money. I found every single hidden account and every fraudulent scheme you three have orchestrated. I looked over at Kiara, who was still standing safely behind me. Her eyes were wide with shock, but she was nodding slowly, a profound sense of relief washing over her face, as she realized I was about to dismantle the people who had abused her. Hayes stood silently guarding the doorway, effectively blocking any chance my family had of escaping this room. "This is not a negotiation, Cynthia," I stated firmly, tapping my fingers against the thick black binders. "You thought you could back me into a corner with a single forged loan application from 5 years ago. You thought you held the winning hand because you are used to manipulating people who do not know how to fight back. But you brought a plastic knife to a nuclear war. You threatened to destroy my license and my husband's firm. Now I am going to show you exactly what happens when you threaten a forensic accountant." I picked up the first black leather binder and flipped it open to the primary index. The pages were filled with highlighted bank routing numbers, highlighted transaction dates, and highly detailed financial flowcharts, mapping out a massive network of illegal activity. The ultimate counterattack had officially begun, and I was going to start by entirely destroying the golden child. I turned my gaze away from my terrified parents and locked my eyes squarely onto my brother. Bradley was trembling now, his bravado completely evaporated. He looked like a cornered rat. "Let us start with your brilliant $50 million tech company, Bradley," I said, my voice dripping with absolute lethal precision. "Let us talk about where your investors' money actually went." Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the heavy soundproof doors. He found no comfort there. Hayes stood like a sentinel watching the destruction of the golden child with quiet, predatory satisfaction. I flipped open the first black leather binder. The crisp sound of the turning page made my mother flinch. I pulled out a stack of bank statements and laid them flat on the mahogany desk. "Let us examine the initial seed funding you secured last April." I began tracing my finger down a column of highlighted numbers. "You raised $3 million from angel investors in Silicon Valley. You promised them a revolutionary cloud storage algorithm. But you never hired a single senior developer, did you, Bradley? You hired 2 fresh college graduates on minimum wage to build a rudimentary wireframe. Instead of investing in research and development," I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy, "you immediately transferred $2.5 million out of your primary corporate account. You moved it through highly convoluted wire transfers. I know how you did it because I tracked every penny. You set up 5 different shell limited liability companies registered in Delaware. You named them with generic, meaningless titles to hide your tracks. You used those shell companies to wash the investor capital clean, making it look like legitimate vendor payments. But those vendors did not exist. You were paying yourself, Richard." Our father leaned forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Riley, you are making absolutely baseless accusations," he stammered, trying to salvage his son's reputation. "You cannot possibly prove any of this." I kept my gaze locked on Bradley, whose chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. I tapped the side of my head. "Routing number 0210000021. I recited completely from memory, letting the numbers hang in the air. "Account number 4489210. That is the offshore account you opened in the Cayman Islands last May. You wired $800,000 into that account on May 12th. 2 days later, you purchased a luxury yacht registered under one of your Delaware shell companies." "How illegal?" Kiara gasped from behind me. Bradley had told her the yacht was a corporate rental for entertaining high-net-worth clients. I could hear her breathing quicken as the reality of her husband's deceit crashed down around her. But I was nowhere near finished. I flipped to the third section of the binder. Then came the second round of funding in September. I stated my tone entirely clinical. You brought in another $4 million based on falsified user metrics. You paid off the initial early investors with the new money to keep them quiet and create the illusion of massive returns. Do you know what the federal authorities call that, Bradley? It is the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. You are a fraudster running a digital pyramid scheme. Stop it! Cynthia shrieked, clutching the edge of the desk. She was trembling violently, her carefully constructed high society facade crumbling into dust. You are lying. Bradley is a genius. His company is valued at $50 million. He showed us the paperwork. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. The paperwork he showed you was fabricated on a laptop in his basement. I fired back, slamming my hand onto a printed spreadsheet. I have the actual unedited balance sheets right here. His company is not worth $50 million. It is currently $10 million in the red. He has 0 active revenue streams. He has defaulted on 3 commercial leases in the past 4 months. And while he was wiring investor money to offshore accounts to purchase luxury cars in August, he intentionally missed 2 consecutive payroll cycles. He failed to pay his own employees, the people who were trying to build his fake product. Bradley was hyperventilating now. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk to keep himself upright. His tailored suit suddenly looked far too big for his shrinking frame. "How did you get this?" He choked out, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "You cannot legally access these accounts." I smiled, a cold, calculated expression of professional triumph. "I am a forensic accountant, Bradley. When you leave a digital footprint this sloppy, it does not take a subpoena to find the cracks in your foundation. I simply followed the breadcrumbs you were too arrogant to cover up." "You are completely bankrupt," I declared, driving the final nail into the coffin of his golden child persona. "Your startup is a hollow shell. Your investors have already started noticing the discrepancies in your quarterly reports. The walls are closing in on you. That is exactly why you were so desperate to corner my husband in this study tonight. You needed a $5 million bailout to stop the entire house of cards from collapsing on top of you. You needed haze to cover your tracks before the authorities realize you have been running a massive Ponzi scheme." Bradley sank into a leather guest chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob. The arrogant, sneering brother who had publicly humiliated me in front of 50 elite guests just 20 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a terrified, broken criminal staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Cynthia stared at the highlighted bank statements on the desk, the undeniable proof of her son's catastrophic failure, staring her right in the face. But the demolition of my toxic family was only half complete. I had dismantled the golden child, but I still had plenty of ammunition left for the people who had created him. I turned my body slowly away from the pathetic sight of my brother sobbing in the guest chair. I locked my eyes onto my mother and father. Richard was gripping his crystal glass so hard, I expected the thick glass to shatter and slice his palm open. Cynthia was practically paralyzed against the edge of the mahogany desk, her chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic jerks. The arrogant high society matriarch who had commanded the ballroom just half an hour ago was entirely gone. I reached back into the titanium briefcase and pulled out the second black leather binder. The heavy thud of the book hitting the desk made both of my parents flinch simultaneously. I flipped the cover open and turned to a section marked with bright red forensic indexing tabs. "Let us revisit the confession you so proudly delivered to my husband just a few minutes ago." I began, my voice dropping into a smooth conversational tone that carried absolute malice. "You stood right there, Cynthia, and boldly admitted to stealing my social security number. You admitted to forging my signature on multiple federal and state loan documents. You justified this massive felony by claiming you needed the $200,000 to provide seed money for Bradley's visionary tech startup. You painted yourself as the ruthless but loving matriarch, willing to cross legal boundaries for the sake of your son's brilliant future." I slid a laminated bank statement across the polished wood, pushing it right under my mother's nose. "But that was just another one of your pathetic lies," I stated coldly. I tracked the disbursement of that $200,000 commercial loan. The funds were deposited into a fictitious vendor account on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, not a single penny of that money had been transferred to Bradley's corporate accounts. Bradley never saw a dime of my stolen credit. Bradley snapped his head up from his hands, his tear-streaked face twisting in sudden confusion. He looked at our mother and then at our father. "What is she talking about?" Bradley choked out. "You told me the bank rejected the seed application. You told me you could not get the funds." I ignored my brother and kept my eyes dead-locked on Richard. The patriarch of the family was currently sweating profusely, his expensive tailored shirt clinging uncomfortably to his chest. "The money did not go to a tech startup," Richard said, shifting my gaze to my father. "It went directly to the East Coast. Specifically, it was wired in 5 separate tranches of $40,000 each to a VIP credit marker account at a major casino resort in Atlantic City. You did not steal my identity to fund a business. You stole my identity to cover your catastrophic gambling debts." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out. I tapped the laminated document. "You spent 2 weeks in Atlantic City that April?" I continued reciting the timeline with ruthless precision. "You sat at the high-stakes baccarat tables and hemorrhaged money you did not actually have. You took out massive markers from the casino credit office to chase your losses. When the casino management finally threatened to pursue legal action and seize your local assets, you panicked. You and Cynthia scrambled to find a clean line of credit to pay off the pit bosses before the country club found out you were a degenerate gambling addict. So you decided to ruin my financial future to save your own pathetic country club reputation." Richard took a staggering step backward, bumping into the liquor cabinet. His hands were shaking violently. "It was a temporary setback," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his exposed shame. "I was going to pay it back, Riley. I had a sure thing lined up. I just needed time to liquidate some bonds." "You did not have any bonds to liquidate, Richard," I fired back, slicing through his pathetic excuse. "Because your entire financial portfolio is an absolute mirage. You have been running on empty for a decade." I turned my focus back to Cynthia. She was staring at the floor, refusing to look at me or her husband. Her silence was a desperate attempt to shield herself from the incoming barrage, but I was not going to let her hide. I pulled a thick legal document from the back of the binder. It was stamped with county clerk seals and heavily highlighted in yellow marker. "Let us talk about this $3 million Tudor mansion, Cynthia," I said, gesturing to the lavish walls of the soundproof study. "The grand estate where you are currently hosting 50 of the wealthiest elites in the Chicago suburbs. You strut around this house like royalty, pouring vintage champagne and bragging about your stock portfolios. But you do not own this house anymore, do you?" Cynthia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "Do not you dare," she hissed, her voice a fragile, trembling thread. "Keep your mouth shut, Riley." I slammed the county clerk document onto the desk right on top of the casino wire transfers. 14 months ago, you secretly took out a massive second mortgage on this property, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. You bypassed the traditional lending institutions because your credit was already stretched to the absolute breaking point. You went to a subprime lender who charged you an astronomical interest rate. You extracted $800,000 in equity just to keep up appearances. You used that money to buy your custom designer gowns, to host these ridiculous high society galas, and to cover the minimum payments on Richard's remaining gambling debts. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the desk, closing the physical distance between myself and my mother. I wanted her to feel the absolute certainty of her impending destruction. "And because you blew through that equity in less than a year, you completely ran out of liquid cash," I stated, watching the last drop of hope drain from her eyes. "You missed the payment in October. You missed the payment in November. You missed the payment in December. You are currently 90 days past due on a massive subprime loan." I pulled one final sheet of paper from the binder. It was a copy of a highly sensitive legal notice. The bank initiated the default protocols last week. I whispered, my voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. The official notice of foreclosure has already been processed by the county. It is literally in the mail system right now, Cynthia. It will arrive in your mailbox on Monday morning. By the end of next month, the bank is going to evict you from this house. They are going to seize everything you own to cover the outstanding debts. The wealthy facade you have spent your entire life building is a complete fraud. I continued, my words striking her like physical blows. You are entirely bankrupt. You are drowning in toxic debt. You are a pair of criminals who stole from your own daughter to fund your gambling addictions and your designer wardrobes. And right now there are 50 people drinking your expensive champagne in the ballroom, totally unaware that they are partying in a house that belongs to a subprime lending bank. Cynthia let out a broken, pathetic whimper. Her knees buckled and she slumped against the mahogany desk, desperately clinging to the polished wood to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Richard covered his face with his hands, leaning heavily against the liquor cabinet as a low, agonizing groan escaped his throat. The wealthy, untouchable parents who had mocked my existence for 34 years were entirely ruined, stripped bare of every single lie they had ever told. The silence that followed my devastating revelation did not last long. It hung in the air for perhaps 10 seconds before the fragile, toxic loyalty that bound my family together completely shattered. The illusion of their unified front evaporated the very second the money disappeared. Richard dropped his hands from his face. His eyes were bloodshot and bulging with a mixture of sheer terror and absolute fury. He lunged away from the liquor cabinet, pointing a shaking finger directly at my mother. A second mortgage. Richard roared, his voice cracking under the strain of his own panic. You took out an $800,000 subprime loan on my house, Cynthia. You told me we were perfectly fine. You told me the trust accounts were generating enough yield to cover my markers at the casino. How could you leverage the roof over my head without consulting me? Cynthia pushed herself off the mahogany desk, her sorrow instantly transforming into a vicious, defensive rage. Your house, she shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that pierced my ears. You absolute fool. It is our house, and we were going to lose it anyway because of your degenerate habits. You sat at those baccarat tables and threw away our entire liquid net worth. You burned through the country club savings. I had to take out that mortgage to keep the bank from foreclosing on us 2 years ago. I did it to save your pathetic reputation, Richard. Do not you dare stand there and act like a victim. I covered your tracks just like I always do. If those 50 people out in the ballroom knew the truth about your gambling, you would be a laughingstock. But Cynthia was not finished. A cornered animal will bite anything in its path, and her gaze violently snapped toward Bradley. The golden child was still sitting in the leather guest chair, trembling and staring at the floor. And you! Cynthia spat, marching toward her son with pure venom in her eyes. I stole my own daughter's identity to keep this family afloat. I risked federal prison to cover your father's debts because you promised us you were building a $50 million empire. You told us your tech company was going to make us billionaires. You promised me a penthouse in Manhattan and a villa in the south of France. I took out credit cards in your name to buy your tailored suits and fund your networking dinners. I funneled the last of my personal savings into your offshore accounts so you could buy a luxury yacht to impress your fake investors. You squandered every single penny. You are nothing but a pathetic con artist. The accusation was the final breaking point for Bradley. He shot up out of the leather chair, kicking it backwards so violently it crashed into the bookshelves. He was no longer the suave, confident executive. He was a terrified, furious child lashing out at the monsters who created him. I am a con artist, Bradley screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. You are the ones who forced me to live this massive lie. You demanded absolute perfection since the day I was born. You paraded me around your country club friends like a prize-winning horse. If I did not have the newest car, the most expensive watch, or the highest-paying job, you looked at me like I was garbage. You told me to fake it until I made it. You told me image was the only thing that mattered in this world. Bradley paced frantically across the Persian rug, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair until it was a disheveled mess. I begged you to let me downsize last year, Bradley yelled, tears of frustration streaming down his cheeks. I told you the startup was struggling. I told you the server costs were eating my margins. And what did you do, Cynthia? You told me to lease a bigger office space. You told me to buy the yacht because successful people do not scale back. You forced me to keep spending money I did not have just so you could brag to your socialite friends about your genius son. You drove me into massive federal fraud because you could not stomach the idea of having an average child. The soundproof study devolved into an absolute war zone. Richard was screaming at Cynthia about financial ruin and demanding to know where the rest of the equity money went. Cynthia was shrieking at Bradley, calling him a massive disappointment and a catastrophic failure who ruined her life. Bradley was shouting back at both of them, cursing their endless greed and their suffocating expectations. The wealthy, untouchable elites were viciously tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. The facade of their loving, supportive family dynamic was completely obliterated. They did not care about each other. They only cared about the money and the status. And now that both were gone, they were perfectly willing to throw each other to the wolves. I stood perfectly still near the heavy oak doors, watching the snake pit consume itself. I felt a warm, strong hand wrapped gently around my waist. I leaned back slightly, resting my shoulders against my husband's chest. Hayes pulled me close, securing me in his protective embrace. We did not say a single word. We did not need to intervene or defend ourselves anymore. We simply stood side by side and watched the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. Kiara stood safely tucked behind us, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror as she witnessed the true nature of the family she had married into. She watched her husband curse his own mother. She watched her father-in-law throw a crystal glass against the fireplace in a blind rage. The reality of their toxicity was laid bare with absolutely nowhere to hide. I felt a profound sense of vindication washing over me. For 34 years, they had made me feel like the broken one. They had labeled me the disappointment, the outsider, the failure. But as I watched them screaming and sobbing in their tailored suits and designer gowns, fighting over the ashes of their fraudulent empire, I knew the absolute truth. I had never been the broken one. I was the only person in this family who had ever been whole. And right now, they were finally paying the ultimate price for every single lie they had ever told. The absolute chaos in the soundproof study suddenly reached a terrifying breaking point. My parents were still hurling vicious insults at each other across the Persian rug, completely blinded by their own financial ruin. But Bradley had stopped yelling. The golden child fell completely silent. I watched his eyes dart wildly around the mahogany room, tracking the exits, looking at the locked doors, and staring at the thick black binders of evidence sitting on my father's desk. The reality of federal prison had finally fractured his mind. He was a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire 36 years of life. Now he was staring down a decade behind bars, and his fragile ego simply snapped. Bradley began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved with violent, ragged gasps. He backed away from his screaming parents, stumbling until his hips hit the edge of the heavy desk. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of his tailored arrogance. His gaze frantically swept across the polished wood surface, searching for a way out, a lifeline, anything that could give him leverage. His bloodshot eyes locked onto a specific object, resting right next to my forensic audit binders. It was a heavy antique brass letter opener. Richard had bought it at an auction years ago. It was designed to look like a medieval dagger, with a solid brass hilt and a long, surprisingly sharp, pointed blade. Before anyone could register the dangerous shift in his demeanor, Bradley lunged. He snatched the heavy brass weapon off the desk, his knuckles turning bone white as he gripped the hilt. He spun around with a wild, unhinged desperation. He did not go for me. He did not go for Hayes. He knew we were too prepared and too protected. Instead, he locked his manic gaze onto the most vulnerable person in the room. Kiara was still standing near the edge of the bookshelves, completely paralyzed by the horror of her in-laws imploding. She was 6 months pregnant and physically exhausted from the emotional whiplash of the evening. She never saw the attack coming. Bradley charged across the space, bridging the gap in 3 massive strides. He grabbed his wife roughly by the arms, spinning her around and yanking her back against his chest. Kiara let out a sharp, terrified shriek as her husband locked his left arm tightly across her collarbone, pinning her against him. He raised his right hand, bringing the sharpened brass letter opener up and holding the pointed metal tip dangerously close to her throat. The entire room froze. The screaming match between Richard and Cynthia stopped, instantly cut off by the sudden horrifying escalation of violence. My mother let out a strangled gasp, clapping both hands over her mouth. My father took a terrified step back, tripping over the leg of a guest chair. The financial dispute had just transformed into a deadly hostage situation right in the middle of their perfect suburban mansion. "Nobody move!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with a manic, psychotic edge. "Do not take a single step toward me. I swear to God I will do it." Kiara whimpered in pure terror, her hands instinctively flying down to protect her pregnant belly. "Bradley, you are hurting me," she sobbed, her voice trembling as she tried to pull away from his grip. "Please stop. Please do not do this. We have a baby." "Shut up," Bradley roared, pressing the brass point closer to her skin. "You brought this on yourself. You all brought this on yourselves. I am not going to federal prison. I am not going to wear an orange jumpsuit while you people sit in your mansions and judge me. I am the chief executive officer. I am the visionary. I am not going to be a loser." He was completely unhinged, detached from reality, and operating on pure adrenaline and panic. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting wildly between me and my husband. He tightened his grip on Kiara, ignoring her desperate pleas for mercy. The golden child had fully transitioned into a violent criminal. He locked his manic stare onto Hayes. "You," Bradley shouted, pointing the brass weapon in my husband's direction for a fraction of a second before bringing it back to Kiara's neck. "Open your laptop right now. Do it." Hayes did not move a single muscle. He stood firmly in front of me, his posture perfectly balanced, and his dark eyes fixed on Bradley with absolute icy calculation. "I know you have your firm accounts on that machine," Bradley continued, his chest heaving as he shouted his demands. "You are going to log into the Apex Holdings server. You are going to wire $5 million into my Cayman Islands account right this second. The routing number is in my briefcase on the floor. Get it, pick it up, and initiate the transfer." My father finally found his voice, raising trembling hands in the air. "Son, please." Richard begged, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Put the weapon down. This is madness. You are assaulting your pregnant wife. We can hire lawyers. We can fight the audit. Just let Kiara go." "I said shut up!" Bradley screamed violently, yanking Kiara backward. "Do not give me advice, you bankrupt failure. You lost the house. You lost everything. You cannot save me. Only he can save me." Bradley refocused his crazed attention entirely on Hayes. $5 million, he demanded, his voice echoing off the soundproof walls. "It is pocket change to you. It is a rounding error on your balance sheet. Wire the money so I can get on a plane tonight and leave this miserable country. If you try to call the police, if you try to alert your security detail, or if you refuse to open that laptop, I will hurt her. I will do it, Hayes. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. Do not test me." The threat was raw and extremely dangerous. Bradley was a coward by nature, but a cornered coward facing decades in prison was capable of horrific violence. He pressed the heavy brass letter opener harder against Kiara's collarbone, making her cry out in pain. The beautiful, pristine study had become a sealed trap. The heavy soundproof doors that my parents had closed to hide their blackmail attempt were now keeping the 50 wealthy guests in the ballroom completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just down the hall. Cynthia fell to her knees on the Persian rug, weeping uncontrollably as she watched her perfect son hold a weapon to his pregnant wife's throat. She had spent 36 years creating a monster feeding his ego, covering his mistakes, and shielding him from every single consequence. Now that monster was fully unleashed, and she was completely powerless to stop him. I stood perfectly still watching the brass blade gleaming under the chandelier light. I could feel my own heart pounding a steady rhythmic beat in my chest. I did not scream. I did not panic. I knew that showing any sign of fear would only feed Bradley's psychotic power trip. I kept my breathing even and my focus entirely sharp. I glanced at Hayes, analyzing his posture. My husband was a man who negotiated hostile corporate takeovers for a living. He dealt with ruthless billionaires and corrupt executives every single day. He was not intimidated by a spoiled suburban child throwing a violent tantrum. Bradley was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically, waiting for Hayes to comply with his insane demands. He thought he held the ultimate leverage. He genuinely believed that taking a hostage would force us to surrender. He thought a sharpened brass letter opener was enough to break our resolve. But he had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with. Hayes did not flinch. He did not raise his hands in surrender or take a panicked step backward. Instead, he simply tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto my brother with a predatory calmness that chilled the room. He looked at Bradley, not as a legitimate physical threat, but as an incredibly foolish insect that had just crawled onto his mahogany desk. Without breaking eye contact, Hayes slowly lifted his left hand. He did not reach for his laptop. He did not reach for his wallet. He simply extended his index finger and tapped the face of his smartwatch twice. A faint blue light pulsed on the screen, confirming a silent signal had been sent. It was a gesture so deliberate and so incredibly controlled that it made Bradley hesitate. The brass letter opener wavered in his shaking hand. Before my brother could process what that smartwatch signal meant, I stepped forward. I did not shout. I did not plead for Kiara's life. I lowered my voice into a slow, soothing, and utterly terrifying register. I spoke to Bradley the exact same way a highly trained hostage negotiator speaks to a desperate amateur who has completely lost control of his own mind. "Bradley," I murmured, keeping my tone perfectly flat and even. "Look at me. Look right at me." His bloodshot eyes snapped toward my face. His chest was heaving, but his grip on Kiara remained tight. He was waiting for me to beg. He was waiting for the hysteria that usually accompanied his violent outbursts. I gave him nothing but absolute frozen logic. "You are not going to hurt her, Bradley," I said, stepping half a pace closer. "You are not going to hurt your wife, and you are certainly not going to hurt your unborn child. You want us to believe you are a dangerous man who has nothing left to lose, but I know you better than anyone else in this room. I know the math behind your entire existence, and the math says you are an absolute coward." "Shut up!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He pressed the dull brass edge closer to Kiara's collarbone. "Wire the money right now, or I will do it." I shook my head slowly, maintaining eye contact. "You will not do it," I replied softly. "Because hurting someone requires a spine. It requires the ability to actually take a physical action and face the immediate visceral consequences of that action. You do not have that capacity, Bradley. You have never fought your own battles. You have never taken a single punch in your entire life. Whenever things get hard, whenever the reality of your own incompetence catches up with you, you hide. You have spent 36 years hiding behind our mother's skirt." Cynthia let out a loud, wretched sob from the floor, but I ignored her entirely. I kept my psychological crosshairs aimed directly at my brother's fragile ego. Richard remained frozen by the liquor cabinet, his jaw trembling as he watched his golden boy unravel completely. "Every time you failed a class, Cynthia bribed the teachers." I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "Every time you crashed a car, Richard paid off the police to bury the report. When your first business went under, they stole my identity to bail you out. You are not a ruthless chief executive officer willing to do whatever it takes to survive. You are a spoiled, terrified little boy who throws a tantrum the second his mommy cannot write a check to fix his mistakes. You do not know anything about me, Bradley spat back, sweat dripping down his temples. His breathing was growing more erratic. He was completely captivated by my words, entirely consumed by the psychological teardown. His attention was zeroed in on my face, completely forgetting his surroundings. "I know everything about you," I countered, taking another slow, deliberate step forward. "I know that your hand is shaking right now because you are absolutely terrified of what happens next. If you press that brass blade into her skin, you cross a line that Cynthia cannot buy your way out of. You go from being a white-collar fraudster to a violent felon. You will be tackled to this floor, and you will spend the rest of your life in a maximum security cell surrounded by men who will tear you apart. You will not survive a single week in federal prison, Bradley. You are weak. You are soft. You are entirely dependent on the illusion of power because you possess absolutely zero actual strength." His eyes widened. The brass letter opener trembled violently in his fist. He opened his mouth to scream another threat, but no sound came out. My words were systematically dismantling the last remaining pillars of his grand delusion. I was holding a mirror up to his soul and forcing him to stare directly at the pathetic, frightened creature looking back. While I kept him locked in this psychological vice, Kiara seized her opportunity. She was a brilliant woman and she understood exactly what I was doing. With Bradley's entire focus glued to my face and his grip loosening slightly in his shock, Kiara began to move. It was not a sudden, jerky motion. It was a slow, agonizingly careful shift of her body weight. Millimeter by millimeter, she slid her shoulder downward, angling her collarbone away from the sharp brass tip. She lowered her center of gravity, planting her feet firmly against the Persian rug. She was creating the crucial inches of space she needed to break free the second the opportunity presented itself. "Look at your hands, Bradley," I whispered, my voice dropping to a hypnotic cadence. "They are sweating. Your pulse is racing. You are looking at my husband, hoping he will just open the laptop and save you from making a decision. You want us to bail you out just like Mom and Dad always did. But Hayes is not going to open that laptop. We are not going to send you $5 million. We are not going to give you a private jet to the Cayman Islands. We are going to stand right here and watch you realize that nobody is coming to save you. I am warning you." He choked out, his voice sounding small and incredibly fragile. "I will do it. I will." "No, you will not," I replied, my tone ringing with absolute finality. "Because you are too scared to bleed and you are too scared to fight. You are just a pathetic fraud, holding a letter opener in your father's study, realizing that the game is completely over. You played your hand, Bradley, and you lost everything." The standoff reached a breaking point. The heavy, soundproof walls seemed to press inward, amplifying the sound of Bradley's ragged breathing. He stood there, paralyzed by his own cowardice, trapped in the spotlight of his total failure. He had the weapon, but I had the absolute psychological high ground. I had stripped him naked in front of his wife, his parents, and the man he desperately wanted to impress. The tension in the room was a physical weight pressing down on all of us. But as Bradley stared at me, his mind fracturing under the pressure, he still believed he had a choice. He still thought this was a negotiation. He had absolutely no idea that the final trap had already been set and the jaws were about to snap shut. The heavy silence in the soundproof study was suddenly broken by a sound that completely shattered Bradley's fragile grip on reality. I laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh or a defensive scoff. It was a soft, genuine chuckle that bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. The sheer absurdity of his demands had finally crossed the threshold from terrifying into downright comical. I stood there looking at the golden child holding a blunt antique letter opener demanding a $5 million wire transfer from a billionaire, as if it would magically erase a decade of federal crimes. Bradley blinked, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute confusion. "What are you laughing at?" he screamed, his voice cracking as a fresh wave of panic washed over him. "Stop laughing at me, Riley. I am not joking. Tell him to open the laptop right now or I swear I will do it." I shook my head slowly, letting the laughter fade into a cold, hard smile. You still do not get it, do you? Bradley, I asked, taking a casual step to the side, forcing him to track my movements and keep his attention entirely off Kiara. You genuinely believe that a wire transfer is going to save you. You think that if Hayes magically deposits $5 million into your offshore account tonight, you can just book a first-class ticket to the Cayman Islands and sip cocktails on the beach for the rest of your life. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. It will cover the margin calls. He stammered, his grip on Kiara slipping just a fraction of an inch as his mind scrambled to justify his delusion. It will pay off the initial investors. Nobody has to know. I let out another soft sigh of absolute pity. Bradley. I am a forensic certified public accountant. I do not just sit in my office printing out bank statements to bring to family parties so I can gloat. I do not collect evidence just to win an argument in our father's study. That is not how my profession works. I pointed to the open titanium briefcase resting on the mahogany desk. Those black leather binders are just copies, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. They are the duplicate files I brought here tonight specifically to watch the look on your faces when you realized the game was over. The original files, the raw data, the certified bank records, and the digital tracking logs are no longer in my possession. My mother's sobbing abruptly stopped. She lifted her tear-streaked face from the Persian rug, her eyes wide with a new, much deeper kind of terror. Richard slowly lowered his hands from his head, his jaw dropping open. 3 days ago, I continued, making sure every single person in the room heard every syllable clearly. I walked into the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I sat down in a conference room with 2 senior agents from the White-Collar Crime Division and a lead investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I handed them every single piece of evidence I have collected over the past 5 years. I gave them the routing numbers for your Delaware shell companies, Bradley. I gave them the fraudulent tax returns you filed, Cynthia. I gave them the casino credit markers you tried to hide, Richard. I handed them a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Bradley stumbled backward, hitting the bookshelves hard. The brass letter opener dropped a few inches away from Kiara's throat, as the sheer magnitude of his destruction finally registered in his brain. You went to the feds, he whispered, his voice entirely hollow, devoid of all the arrogance that had defined his entire existence. You turned your own family into the feds. You are not my family, I fired back, stepping forward and completely closing the psychological distance. You are a criminal syndicate operating out of a suburban mansion, and the federal government took my audit very seriously. They spent the last 72 hours verifying my data, freezing your offshore accounts, and securing the necessary warrants from a federal judge. I looked at my mother, who was now clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. You thought this New Year's Eve gala was a triumph, Cynthia, I said, my tone dripping with absolute venom. You thought you were hosting the social event of the season. You invited 50 of the wealthiest investors and politicians in Chicago to parade your success. But you actually did the federal authorities a massive favor. Richard gasped, gripping the edge of the liquor cabinet to keep from collapsing. What did you do, Riley? He choked out, his face a mask of pure horror. I did not just come here tonight to confront you, I explained, letting the reality of their situation crush them completely. The feds needed all the key players in one place. They needed to ensure nobody was going to book a sudden flight out of the country when the asset freezes hit the banking system. They needed you, Richard. They needed you, Cynthia. And they especially needed the golden child. This entire party was not a celebration. It was a trap. It was the perfect bait to keep you all inside this house drinking champagne and patting yourselves on the back while the authorities moved into position. I glanced over at Hayes, who was still standing perfectly still, his dark eyes watching the spectacular implosion of my abusers. He did not tap his smartwatch earlier to check the time I revealed, pointing to my husband's wrist. He tapped it to send a silent encrypted signal to his security detail parked at the end of your driveway. and they immediately relayed that signal directly to the federal agents waiting in the staging area just 2 blocks away. The heavy brass letter opener finally slipped from Bradley's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud entirely forgotten. Kiara instantly ripped herself away from his weakened grip, stumbling forward into my outstretched arms. I pulled her tightly against my side, shielding her pregnant belly as she gasped for air. "You are completely surrounded," I announced, my voice echoing through the soundproof study like a judge's final gavel strike. "There is no $5 million wire transfer. There is no offshore escape route. The warrants have already been signed, and the execution order was given the exact second Hayes tapped that watch. The game is over, and you have absolutely nowhere left to run." Right on cue, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, waiting for my final sentence to drop. The absolute reality of their situation materialized outside the estate. The heavy, oppressive silence inside the mahogany study was suddenly broken by a deep, vibrating rumble. It was a sound that bypassed the thick soundproof walls and resonated directly through the hardwood floorboards beneath our feet. Richard stumbled back against his liquor cabinet, his glass decanter rattling violently against the polished wood. Cynthia remained frozen on the Persian rug, her eyes wide and vacant as she stared at the floor. Bradley was completely immobilized, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending destruction. He did not even attempt to bend down and retrieve the brass letter opener he had dropped. He just stood there, a hollow shell of the arrogant golden child, listening to the mechanized roar of heavy engines tearing up their pristine suburban driveway. Then came the light. It started as a faint, rhythmic pulsing reflecting off the snow-covered lawn outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the study. Within seconds, that faint pulse exploded into a blinding, chaotic strobe of crimson and sapphire. Brilliant flashes of red and blue police lights pierced directly through the gaps in the heavy velvet drapes. The harsh, aggressive glare washed over the expensive artwork, the leather armchairs, and the faces of my terrified family members. It painted their pale skin in alternating strokes of neon red and cold blue, highlighting every single bead of sweat and every line of panic. The majestic $3 million Tudor mansion was no longer a symbol of elite wealth and untouchable status. It was instantly transformed into an active federal crime scene, illuminated for the entire upscale neighborhood to witness. The visual assault was immediately followed by a deafening auditory invasion. The wail of multiple police sirens cut through the freezing Chicago winter night. They were not approaching from a distance anymore. They were parked directly on the front lawn, screaming at maximum volume. The sheer noise level overpowered the expensive soundproofing of my father's private sanctuary. I kept my arm wrapped securely around Kiara, holding her close as she buried her face in my shoulder, trembling with a mixture of shock and profound relief. Hayes took a subtle step forward, positioning his broad shoulders between us and the windows, effectively shielding us from any unpredictable movements my family might make in their final moments of desperation. But my family was completely incapable of movement. They were entirely captivated by the chaotic light show playing out across their mahogany walls. Beyond the heavy oak doors of the study, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom was rapidly disintegrating. Even through the thick wood, I could hear the sheer bedlam erupting among the 50 elite guests. The smooth, elegant notes of the live jazz quartet died, instantly replaced by a chorus of panicked shouts and high-pitched screams. The influential politicians, hedge fund managers, and country club presidents, who had been sipping vintage champagne and mocking my existence mere minutes ago, were now completely losing their minds. I could hear the chaotic stampede of expensive leather shoes and designer heels scrambling across the marble foyer. The socialites who had sneered at me were now frantically trying to figure out how to escape a raided property without getting their faces plastered across tomorrow morning's newspaper front pages. The pristine, untouchable high society bubble that Cynthia and Richard had spent decades ruthlessly protecting was popping with violent, spectacular force. The muffled chaos in the hallway outside abruptly shifted. The panicked scrambling of wealthy guests was forcefully shoved aside by a new distinct sound. It was the synchronized, thunderous stomping of heavy tactical boots, marching in perfect unison down the hardwood corridor. My father let out a pathetic whimpering sound, pressing his back hard against the liquor cabinet, as if he could somehow merge with the wood paneling and disappear. Cynthia covered her ears with her hands, squeezing her eyes shut in a desperate, childish attempt to block out the reality of her own actions. Bradley just stared blankly at the heavy oak doors, his chest barely moving, his spirit entirely broken. The heavy brass latch of the soundproof doors never even had a chance to turn. The breach was absolute and unapologetic. A tremendous physical force slammed into the exterior of the solid oak doors. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. The expensive reinforced hinges tore straight out of the doorframe, raining metal screws and shards of wood across the Persian rug. The doors were violently kicked open, crashing back against the interior walls with a concussive boom that made the floor shake. A flood of law enforcement personnel poured into the private study. Federal agents wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with bright yellow FBI lettering swarmed the room. They were immediately followed by local police officers and specialized financial crime investigators holding official warrants. The pristine sanctuary of my father's illicit business dealings was instantly overrun by heavily armed authority figures. The stark, aggressive contrast between the bespoke tuxedos and designer silk gowns of my family and the utilitarian tactical gear of the federal agents was an absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. The agents moved with ruthless efficiency, securing every corner of the room in a matter of seconds. Flashlights cut through the dim corners of the study, sweeping over the bookshelves, the safe hidden behind the oil painting, and the titanium briefcase resting on the mahogany desk. Commands were shouted rapidly, ordering everyone to keep their hands visible and remain exactly where they stood. The sheer overwhelming presence of the law enforcement officers completely sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. The untouchable image my parents had so carefully cultivated, the massive lie they had used to abuse me and elevate my brother, was permanently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right before my eyes in the ruined room. Smiling, it was over. Smiling, it was over. I watched the absolute chaos unfold with a profound sense of vindication. The tactical agents swarmed the study, moving with a terrifying and calculated speed. Their flashlights cut through the dim lighting, sweeping past the expensive oil paintings and locking directly onto my brother. Bradley was standing frozen near the center of the Persian rug. The brass letter opener he had used to threaten his pregnant wife was still resting on the hardwood floor where he had dropped it moments earlier. He did not try to run. He did not try to fight. The sheer, overwhelming presence of heavily armed federal authorities completely short-circuited his fragile mind. "FBI, get down on the ground right now," a lead agent roared, pointing a stark tactical light straight into Bradley's terrified eyes. "Keep your hands where we can see them and drop to your knees." The golden child let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail. His knees buckled instantly, sending him crashing onto the expensive rug. He raised his trembling hands above his head, sobbing hysterically. "Please do not shoot me," Bradley begged, his voice cracking into a wretched squeak. "I did not mean to hurt anyone. It was a mistake. My parents made me do it." Two agents closed the distance in a fraction of a second. They did not care about his excuses. They grabbed him by the shoulders, yanking him roughly to his feet before spinning him around. They slammed him face first against the polished surface of my father's mahogany desk. The sheer force of the impact rattled the titanium briefcase and scattered the forged manila envelope across the floor. Bradley cried out in pain as the agents forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the room, sealing his fate. The arrogant technology executive who had mocked my life just an hour ago was now nothing but a weeping, broken criminal pinned against the very desk where his fraudulent empire had been built. While the agent secured Bradley, Kiara let out a massive, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had kept her standing finally evaporated, leaving her physically trembling. She rushed forward, throwing her arms around my neck and burying her face in my shoulder. I caught her immediately, wrapping both my arms tightly around her back, holding her and her unborn child safe from the madness consuming the room. "You are okay, Kiara," I whispered fiercely, keeping my voice steady to ground her. "You are completely safe now. He is never going to touch you again." Hayes stepped closer, resting his large hand protectively on my back, effectively shielding both of us from the aggressive movements of the law enforcement personnel. A female officer approached us quickly, her expression professional but checking for injuries. She gently guided Kiara to a leather guest chair, ensuring she was seated and out of the immediate line of fire. Kiara sat down, clutching her pregnant belly, crying soft tears of profound relief as she watched the monster she had married get completely neutralized by the federal government. Across the room, my parents were experiencing their own customized nightmare. Richard had remained pressed against his liquor cabinet, hoping the agents would somehow overlook him. He was completely wrong. Two federal investigators marched straight toward the patriarch of the family. Richard raised his hands weakly, his face completely devoid of color. "Gentlemen, there is a massive misunderstanding here," Richard stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I am a respected member of this community. I know the mayor. I have a pristine reputation." "Save it for the judge." "Richard," an agent interrupted, grabbing my father's arm and twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Richard let out a loud, pathetic groan as the steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. He squeezed his eyes shut, unable to face the reality of his total public ruin. Cynthia, however, did not go down quietly. The high society matriarch who had spent her entire adult life commanding respect through intimidation and stolen money absolutely lost her mind. As a female agent approached her, Cynthia backed into the bookshelves, shrieking at the top of her lungs. "Get your hands off me," Cynthia screamed, swatting wildly at the agent. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the host of this party. This is my house. You are ruining my carpets. I will sue every single one of you for trespassing." The agent did not even flinch. She simply grabbed Cynthia's flailing wrist, twisted her around, and slammed her face first into the heavy wooden shelves. Cynthia's designer silk gown ripped at the seam as she was forcefully subdued. "You do not own this house anymore, Mom," the agent stated coldly, snapping the cuffs onto my mother's wrists. "And you are under arrest for identity theft, bank fraud, and extortion." Cynthia began to thrash against the bookshelves, wailing like a spoiled child denied a toy. "My baby," she cried, looking over her shoulder at Bradley, who was still pinned against the mahogany desk. "Bradley, tell them to stop. Tell them it was all your idea. Tell them your father and I had nothing to do with your offshore accounts." The sheer betrayal in her voice was spectacular. Even in handcuffs facing federal prison, Cynthia was still trying to throw her golden child under the bus to save her own skin. Bradley just sobbed harder, snot and tears smearing across the polished wood of the desk. The lead investigator stepped to the center of the room, holding up a warrant. The chaos instantly settled down as his authoritative voice cut through the weeping and the sirens. "You have the right to remain silent," the investigator announced loudly, ensuring the words bounced off the soundproof walls and struck the ears of every single criminal in the room. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The recitation of the Miranda rights hung heavy in the air, a cold, sterile confirmation of their absolute defeat. "Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" the agent demanded. Richard nodded weakly, staring blankly at the floor. Cynthia let out another wretched sob, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. Bradley just whimpered against the mahogany wood, completely broken. I stood securely beside Hayes, my arm resting around Kiara's shoulders, watching the horrific scene unfold. The reality of decades in federal prison had finally settled over the golden child and his enablers. The untouchable family was gone forever, replaced by three terrified felons who were about to lose everything they had ever stolen. The agents moved to haul the prisoners to their feet. Before the officers could fully secure their grip, Cynthia violently twisted her shoulders. She did not try to run toward the door or fight the federal investigators. Instead, she threw her entire body weight forward and intentionally collapsed onto the Persian rug directly at my feet. Richard, seeing his wife drop instantly, followed suit. His knees hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud right beside her. The two most arrogant people I had ever known, who had spent my entire life looking down on me from their imaginary pedestals, were now literally groveling on the floor in front of me, with their hands locked in cold steel cuffs. "Riley, please," Cynthia wailed, her voice completely stripped of its usual pretentious refinement. Her expensive silk gown was torn at the shoulder, and her carefully styled hair hung in ragged clumps across her tear-stained face. "Tell them to stop. Tell these men it is all a massive misunderstanding. You are our daughter. You cannot let them take us away in handcuffs. Just make a phone call and clear this up. We can fix this as a family." She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Richard shifted his desperate gaze upward, bypassing me entirely, and locking his bloodshot eyes onto Hayes. He still foolishly believed that men of wealth protected each other. "Hayes, please," Richard begged, his voice trembling. "You understand how business works. Sometimes lines get blurred. We are your family now. You have billions in liquid assets. You can post our bail. You can hire defense attorneys to bury this audit. We are family, Hayes. Family protects family." Hayes looked down at my father with absolute sub-zero disgust. He simply let a cold, ruthless smile touch the corners of his mouth. "I protect my wife." Richard Hayes stated, his tone vibrating with quiet, lethal authority. "I do not protect the parasites who tried to extort me, and I certainly do not write bail checks for identity thieves. You are a liability that my wife just brilliantly liquidated. Your freedom expired the second you threatened the woman I love." The federal agent stepped forward, ready to drag my parents away, but I raised my hand. I signaled the lead investigator to give me exactly 1 minute. The agent nodded, stepping back just a fraction of an inch. I slowly lowered myself, crouching down until I was directly at eye level with my mother. Cynthia was shaking violently, her chest heaving as she stared at me. She was waiting for the obedient little girl she used to bully to suddenly emerge and save her. That girl was completely dead and gone. You stood in the middle of that ballroom less than an hour ago. I began, my voice dropping into a smooth, terrifyingly calm whisper. You clinked your champagne glasses, and you let Bradley humiliate me in front of 50 people. You called me a failure tonight, Cynthia. You looked at me with absolute contempt and told your wealthy friends that I was a pathetic disappointment. But take a really good look around this room. I continued, gesturing to the shattered doors, the flashing police lights, and the federal agents. Look at your golden child weeping against the desk. Look at your husband begging on his knees. The only failures here are the people who will spend the rest of their lives wearing orange jumpsuits in a federal penitentiary." Cynthia let out a choked sob. "Riley, we had to do it. We did it for the family." I leaned in closer. "Family does not steal from family." "Cynthia," I fired back, every single word landing like a physical blow. "Real loving family protects each other from the harsh realities of the world, instead of pushing their own children into the fire just to keep themselves warm. You are nothing but selfish cowards who built an entire identity around looking down on other innocent people while secretly running a pathetic scam. You used my name to protect yourselves because you lacked the basic decency to face the consequences of your own catastrophic financial failures. Family does not hijack their daughter's social security number to fund a fraudulent tech company. Family does not take out secret second mortgages to cover degenerate gambling debts and then threaten to destroy their daughter's professional license to hide the evidence." Richard tried to speak, his voice a pathetic, raspy whine. "We gave you a roof over your head. We raised you. You raised a target," I corrected him. "You raised someone you thought you could easily manipulate. You kept me around so Bradley would always have someone to look down on. You wanted a scapegoat, and instead you accidentally raised the forensic accountant who just dismantled your entire criminal enterprise. You were too arrogant to ever see it coming. I stood back up, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I looked down at them one last time, feeling the final heavy chains of my childhood trauma completely detach from my soul. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I only felt the pure, unadulterated clarity of absolute justice. I turned my head and looked at the lead federal agent. "I am completely finished here," I announced, stepping back into the secure shelter of my husband's embrace. "You can take the prisoners out now." The agents immediately surged forward. They grabbed Richard and Cynthia by their arms, hauling the screaming, weeping elites roughly to their feet. My mother began to thrash against the officers, her cries echoing horribly off the mahogany walls as the reality of her total destruction finally eclipsed her denial. My father just went entirely limp, allowing the authorities to drag his dead weight across the Persian rug. The pathetic groveling was officially over. The brutal, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system had taken total control, and absolutely nothing on earth could ever save them now. The heavy boots of the federal agents thudded against the hardwood floor as they marched their high society prisoners out of the mahogany study. I stepped out of the room with Hayes right beside me, keeping Kiara safely tucked behind our shoulders. The long corridor leading back to the grand foyer felt entirely different now. The agents forcefully marched Richard, Cynthia, and Bradley in a single file line, keeping a tight physical grip on their arms to prevent any sudden movements. As we approached the end of the hallway, the muffled sounds of the grand ballroom grew significantly louder. The 50 elite guests were entirely trapped in the massive foyer, corralled by local police officers who had secured the perimeter of the estate to ensure nobody tampered with potential evidence. The wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites were buzzing with anxious, panicked whispers. They were demanding answers from the stoic police officers, threatening to call their highly paid lawyers, and complaining about the sheer indignity of being detained at a New Year's Eve gala. They had absolutely no idea what kind of spectacular humiliation was about to walk right through those double doors. The lead federal investigator pushed the remaining intact door wide open and stepped into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. The sudden appearance of a heavily armed tactical agent instantly silenced the entire room of billionaires and socialites. The angry demands and entitled complaints died in their throats. The massive foyer went completely dead quiet. 50 pairs of perfectly manicured eyes locked onto the doorway. And then the main event had finally arrived. The federal agents marched Bradley out first. The golden child of the Chicago suburbs was pushed into the bright light of the foyer, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that was now hopelessly wrinkled and smeared with his own tears and sweat. His hands were locked tightly behind his back in cold steel handcuffs. Bradley did not even try to maintain his dignity. He kept his head down, sobbing openly and pathetically, his shoulders shaking with every wretched gasp. The visionary tech chief executive officer was entirely exposed as a weeping, broken fraud. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elites. Several women in expensive silk gowns instinctively raised their hands to cover their mouths in shock. But the horror show was only just beginning. Right behind Bradley, the agents dragged my father into the room. Richard stumbled over the edge of the Persian rug, his legs barely able to support his own weight. The powerful patriarch who had spent the evening pouring expensive vintage champagne was now just a sweating, trembling criminal. He desperately tried to turn his head away from his business partners. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could magically disappear into the marble floor, but the harsh chandelier light illuminated every single ounce of his profound disgrace. Then finally came my weeping mother. Cynthia was forcefully hauled into the foyer by a female agent, her designer gown ripped at the shoulder. The high society matriarch, who had spent 36 years ruthlessly judging every other woman in her social circle, was now the ultimate spectacle of absolute ruin. Cynthia tried frantically to hide her face, attempting to shield herself from the burning judgment of her peers, but the handcuffs completely restricted her movements. She let out a soft, pathetic wail, as she made direct eye contact with the president of her exclusive country club. The initial shock among the 50 guests rapidly transformed into something much more dangerous and permanent. The realization of what was actually happening hit the room like a physical shockwave. These were not stupid people. They were ruthless financial predators, and they instantly understood that my family was being hauled away for severe white-collar crimes. The polite elite solidarity completely vanished, replaced by morbid fascination and aggressive self-preservation. Suddenly, the grand foyer lit up with a rapid succession of bright and aggressive flashes. The wealthy guests were pulling out their smartphones, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society etiquette. They were actively recording the spectacular downfall of their hosts. Camera shutters clicked endlessly, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The socialites who had smiled and drank Cynthia's expensive wine were now live streaming her federal perp walk to their entire networks. Cynthia shrieked, hiding her face against her chest as the camera flashes blinded her. "Stop it!" she wailed, her voice cracking under the unbearable weight of her public destruction. "Stop taking those pictures! I am your friend. You know me." But they did not stop. They pushed closer, angling their phones to get a better shot of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The social death of my parents was happening in real time, entirely documented and burned into the digital consciousness of the Chicago elite. I walked into the foyer right behind the agents with Hayes standing tall and protective at my side. I looked at the crowd of flashing cameras and the horrified faces of the investors. I watched as my family was paraded through the center of the room like captured animals. They had spent my entire life caring only about their public image. They had sacrificed my happiness, my financial security, and my mental health just to maintain the illusion of their perfect wealthy lifestyle. Now that very same public image was being completely and permanently executed. The federal agents did not slow down. They marched the three weeping criminals straight toward the massive front entrance. The cold winter wind blasted into the foyer as the doors were thrown open, revealing a fleet of police cruisers parked across the snow-covered lawn. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the icy driveway, waiting to transport the golden child and his enablers to a federal holding cell. They were shoved out into the freezing night, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom, leaving behind a dark legacy of absolute catastrophic humiliation. The flashing red and blue police lights slowly faded from the grand foyer as the heavy front doors slammed shut behind the federal tactical agents. The deafening roar of the elite crowd was still echoing through the massive mansion, but I completely tuned it out. I turned my back on the spectacular social execution of my toxic family. My focus shifted entirely to the woman standing beside me. Kiara was shivering violently, her hands wrapped protectively around her pregnant belly. The sheer adrenaline that had fueled her brave defiance earlier was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind profound physical exhaustion and raw shock. I gently placed my hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the chaotic marble foyer and the prying eyes of the 50 wealthy guests who were currently scrambling to salvage their own reputations. "Let us go back to the study," I said, my voice soft and reassuring. "You need to sit down before you collapse." Hayes walked ahead of us, clearing the path. We stepped over the splintered wood and shattered brass hinges of the broken oak doors, re-entering my father's private sanctuary. The soundproof room was completely empty now, stripped of the arrogant monsters who had occupied it just 30 minutes ago. The expensive Persian rug was scuffed with the heavy boot prints of federal agents. The crystal whiskey glass my father had thrown was shattered against the stone fireplace. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy with the aftermath of absolute destruction, but for the very first time it actually felt safe. Hayes pulled the leather guest chair away from the mahogany desk, brushing off a stray piece of paper. He offered the seat to Kiara with quiet, gentlemanly respect. She sank into the leather, letting out a long, shuddering breath. Her dark eyes darted around the ruined study, struggling to process the catastrophic implosion of her marriage and her future. "I have absolutely nothing," Kiara whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her sudden, terrifying reality. Bradley controlled all the bank accounts. He put my name on the lease for his car. I do not have a job. I am 6 months pregnant, and my husband is going to federal prison. I do not even have a place to sleep tonight, Riley. I knelt down on the scuffed Persian rug, positioning myself right in front of her. I reached out and took both of her trembling hands in mine. My grip was firm, transferring my own calm certainty directly into her. "You are not going to be homeless, Kiara," I stated, locking my eyes onto hers. "You are not going to be saddled with Bradley's fraudulent debts. And you are certainly not going to face this pregnancy alone. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just calculate how to dismantle criminal enterprises. I calculate exactly how to protect the innocent casualties caught in the crossfire." I released her hands and stood up. I walked around the mahogany desk and approached my open titanium briefcase. The black leather audit binders had done their job perfectly, tearing down the golden child and his enablers. But there was one final item resting at the very bottom of the metal case. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, pristine white envelope. It was sealed with a simple silver clasp, entirely untouched by the chaos of the evening. I walked back around the desk and gently placed the heavy envelope directly into Kiara's lap. She looked down at the white paper, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I have been building this forensic case against my parents and my brother for 5 years," I explained, keeping my tone incredibly gentle. "But I have been watching you for the last 2. I watched how Bradley treated you. I saw the microaggressions from my mother. I saw you trying to be a good wife to a man who was fundamentally incapable of love. I knew that when I finally pulled the trigger and brought this family down, you were going to be standing right in the blast radius. So I made preparations specifically for you." "Open it," Hayes encouraged, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet room. He stepped up to stand right beside me, presenting a unified front of absolute protection. Kiara slowly unfastened the silver clasp. Her hands were still shaking as she reached inside and pulled out a meticulously organized stack of legal and financial documents. She stared at the topmost paper, her eyes widening in absolute shock. "Those are expedited divorce papers," I explained, pointing to the crisp legal document. "I hired the most ruthless family law attorney in Chicago last month. The papers are already perfectly drafted, citing extreme financial fraud and federal criminal charges as the primary grounds for immediate dissolution of the marriage. They grant you sole physical and legal custody of your child. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line. Bradley will be served in his holding cell by tomorrow morning. He has absolutely zero leverage and zero funds to fight it." Kiara let out a choked gasp, flipping to the next item in the stack. A heavy set of polished brass keys slid out, landing in her palm. Attached to the keys was a certified real estate deed and a comprehensive lease agreement. "I told you that you were not going to be homeless tonight," I continued, smiling softly. "Those are the keys to a luxury 3-bedroom apartment in downtown Chicago. It is located in a highly secure building with 24-hour concierge service, completely inaccessible to any media reporters or angry extended family members. The rent, the utilities, and the security deposits have been paid in full for the next 2 solid years. The nursery is already painted and furnished. You can move in tonight, safely away from this toxic disaster." Tears began to stream down Kiara's face, splashing onto the crisp legal documents. She shook her head side to side, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the safety net I had just deployed. "Riley," she sobbed, pressing her hand against her mouth. "This is too much. I cannot accept this. I have no way to pay you back. I have no income to support myself after the baby comes." Hayes leaned forward, resting his large hands on the back of her leather chair. "Look at the last document in the envelope, Kiara," my husband instructed, his tone radiating professional respect. Kiara pulled out a heavy piece of customized corporate stationery bearing the sleek embossed logo of Apex Holdings. She scanned the text, her jaw dropping as she read the precise legal terms. "It is an executive employment contract," Hayes explained smoothly. "My Human Resources Department at Apex Holdings has been looking for a senior director of employee relations for 3 months." I have reviewed your previous background in corporate administration and your spotless professional track record before you married Bradley. You are exactly the kind of highly ethical, hardworking talent my firm requires. The starting salary is firmly in the six figures. You will receive comprehensive platinum health insurance covering your entire pregnancy and delivery. You also get 6 months of fully paid maternity leave starting the day your child is born. Kiara looked from the employment contract to Hayes and then finally to me. The sheer terror that had gripped her soul since the federal agents breached the door was entirely washed away. It was replaced by a profound, overwhelming tidal wave of relief. She had been standing on the absolute edge of a terrifying abyss, expecting to fall into ruin alongside the criminal family she had married into. Instead, she had been caught by an impenetrable safety net, woven with meticulous care and absolute financial power. "You did all of this for me," Kiara wept, clutching the documents tightly to her chest. "You planned all of this just to save me." I knelt back down on the Persian rug, looking directly into the tear-filled eyes of the only person in this house who had ever treated me with genuine human decency. I reached out and gently rested my hand on her pregnant belly, feeling the faint flutter of life inside. "You and my niece or nephew deserve a real family," I said, my voice thick with raw, authentic emotion. "You deserve a life built on honesty and respect, not fraud and toxic manipulation. We are cutting out the poison tonight, Kiara. Let us start over." Kiara completely broke down. She leaned forward in the leather chair, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and sobbing into my shoulder with profound, shattering gratitude. I held her firmly, letting her cry out all the fear, all the abuse, and all the stress of the past 2 years. We were sitting in the ruined study of a fallen empire, but the air finally felt clean. I very gently rubbed Kiara's trembling back until her exhausted tears finally subsided completely and her breathing steadied into a deeply calm, rhythmic pattern. She pulled back slowly, wiping her tired eyes with the soft sleeve of her maternity blouse, but her face was completely and utterly transformed. The heavy dark shadow of fear that had plagued her delicate features for months was entirely gone, replaced by the brilliant, beautiful dawn of genuine hope. I helped her stand up, making absolutely sure she was perfectly balanced on her feet. Hayes reached across the mahogany desk and quietly clicked the titanium briefcase shut, securing the dual metallic latches. He picked it up, his movements sharp and deliberate, signaling that our business in this toxic house was officially concluded. We walked out of the soundproof study together, leaving behind the shattered doors, the scuffed rug, and the absolute wreckage of my father's fraudulent empire. The quiet, long journey back through the grand hallway was completely and undeniably surreal. The sprawling mansion, which had been overflowing with 50 arrogant socialites and wealthy investors just an hour ago, was now a sterile, active federal crime scene. The extravagant floral arrangements looked ridiculous against the backdrop of bright yellow police tape strung across the entryways. Uniformed officers were securing the perimeter, while specialized investigators cataloged the expensive artwork for future asset seizure. The live jazz quartet had long since fled the scene, leaving their expensive instruments abandoned in the corner. The entire estate felt hollow, stripped of its pretentious warmth and exposed. It was a massive hollow shell, built entirely on stolen money and shattered lives. A serious federal agent handed Hayes his dark cashmere overcoat, while I retrieved my own thick wool coat, wrapping it tightly around my freezing shoulders. We escorted Kiara outside to a waiting town car that Hayes had pre-arranged. The driver stood ready by the open door, holding an umbrella to shield her from the falling snow. Kiara turned to me one last time, wrapping me in another fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of profound emotion. "Thank you for giving my baby a real future." I smiled warmly, returning the hug. "Drive straight to the apartment," I told her. "The building concierge is expecting you and the heat is already turned up. Sleep well, Kiara. Tomorrow is a brand new day." We stood and watched closely as the town car smoothly pulled out of the snowy driveway, carrying my sister-in-law away from the darkness and toward the bright, safe future she truly deserved. Hayes and I turned and began to walk down the long, winding driveway of the seized property. The heavy front doors closed behind us for the final time. The very moment we stepped away from the Tudor mansion, a sharp, sudden gust of crisp, freezing Chicago winter air hit my face hard. It was aggressively cold, but it felt absolutely magnificent. I took a long, deep breath, filling my lungs with the pure, icy wind. For the first time in my life, the suffocating weight of my family's expectations was entirely gone. I was no longer the designated scapegoat or the disappointment they could easily kick around to make themselves feel taller. I had confronted the demons of my childhood. I had dragged their monstrous secrets out into the blinding light of day, and I had permanently and completely dismantled their power over me. As we finally reached the heavy wrought iron gates at the end of the property line, my smartphone buzzed softly in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the bright digital screen. The glowing numbers shifted from 11:59 to exactly 12 midnight. At that precise second, a booming crack echoed across the night sky. I looked straight up past the bare winter trees and toward the distant illuminated skyline of downtown Chicago. Massive, brilliant bursts of vibrant color began to explode against the pitch-black canvas. Brilliant streaks of gold, emerald, and sapphire illuminated the heavy snow clouds, cascading downward in spectacular glittering showers. The entire city was officially ringing in the new year with a thunderous, magnificent display of light and sound. I finally stopped walking and stood there on the snow-covered sidewalk, completely mesmerized by the exploding fireworks. Hayes stopped right beside me. He wrapped his strong arm securely around my waist, pulling my body flush against his warm side. I leaned my head against his broad shoulder, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his heavy cashmere coat. We stood together in the quiet suburban street, watching the brilliant colors reflect off the fresh white snow surrounding us. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over my entire soul. The anxiety, the anger, and the deep-seated trauma that had plagued my mind for decades simply dissolved into the freezing winter air. Society frequently tells us that family is an unbreakable bond, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our genetics, regardless of how horribly they treat us. But standing there watching the sky light up with a million beautiful colors, I knew the absolute truth. Blood does not automatically grant someone a free pass to abuse you. Genetics do not give anyone the right to steal your identity or belittle your fundamental human worth. Cutting off toxic blood is a massive necessary cleansing. It is a surgical removal of poison from your life that allows you to finally breathe, heal, and thrive. I walked into that mansion as a survivor, and I am walking away as an absolute victor. My future belongs entirely to me. Have you ever had to walk away from people who shared your blood to protect your own sanity and future? Share your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of people taking their power back. Remember, your worth is never defined by those who are too blind to see it. The chilling yet empowering saga of Riley dismantling her fraudulent family's empire on New Year's Eve teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of familial bonds. Society often conditions us to believe that blood ties are sacred and unbreakable, demanding endless forgiveness and loyalty, regardless of the cost to our own well-being. However, this story shatters that dangerous illusion. We learn that sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to exploit, belittle, or manipulate you. For 34 years, Riley was cast as the family scapegoat, forced to endure relentless emotional abuse and even identity theft at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her journey from being the mocked black sheep to the orchestrator of her own justice illustrates that cutting off toxic family members is not an act of cruelty or failure. Instead, it is a vital, courageous act of self-preservation. It is the surgical removal of poison that allows a person to finally breathe, heal, and genuinely thrive. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support, not on extortion, shallow facades, and greed. When people use you to fund their delusions or tear you down simply to elevate a golden child, walking away becomes your greatest victory. Riley's ultimate triumph was not just the exposure of her abusers, but her realization that her worth was never tied to their validation. She created her own safety net, protected the innocent, and chose her own peace over a lifetime of manipulation. If you are currently trapped in a cycle of family toxicity, remember that you have the power to rewrite your narrative. Take that brave first step toward your own freedom today.